At the very northern tip of the Philippines, closer to Taiwan than to Manila, sits a tiny province where houses are built with walls nearly a meter thick, made not from wood or modern concrete, but from stacked limestone and coral rock, engineered specifically to survive winds capable of flattening almost anything else standing in their path. This isn't a place bracing for one bad storm season. This is a community that has spent centuries designing an entire way of life around the near certainty that powerful typhoons will keep coming, year after year, generation after generation. And roughly 18,000 people still choose to call it home. This is Batanes, and it might be the most quietly resilient place in the entire Philippines. Picture a province sitting directly inside one of the most typhoon-battered stretches of ocean on the planet, a corridor where powerful tropical storms regularly form and barrel through with little warning. Picture houses built with stone walls thick enough to double as bunkers, topped with roofs woven from grass a full meter deep, a design refined over centuries specifically to keep entire families safe when the wind outside turns violent. And picture a community so committed to honesty and mutual trust that some of its roadside shops operate with absolutely no one watching the till at all, customers simply leaving payment behind on their own. How does a place this exposed to nature's worst produce a culture this remarkably calm, resilient, and trusting? Let's find out. Batanes sits at the very northernmost edge of the Philippine archipelago, closer to the island of Taiwan than to the Philippine capital of Manila, separated from Taiwan by roughly 190 kilometers of open water across the Bashi Channel, a strait notorious throughout the region for its violent currents and unpredictable seas, and often cited by sailors and fishermen alike as one of the roughest, most treacherous stretches of navigable water anywhere in Southeast Asia. The province consists of a small cluster of islands, only 3 of which are permanently inhabited. Batan, home to the provincial capital of Basco and the majority of the population, along with the more remote islands of Sabtong and Itbayat, the latter so isolated and rugged that even other Filipinos consider a visit there a genuine adventure. Its dramatic cliffs plunging 100 meters straight down into crashing surf, and its small, tightly knit community of a few thousand residents living a pace of life largely untouched by the modest tourism growth reshaping the more accessible parts of the province. Together, the entire province covers a landmass smaller than a mid-sized city district, making Batanes both the smallest province in the Philippines by population and one of its most physically isolated, cut off from the rest of the country by open ocean that regularly turns too dangerous to cross by boat for days or even weeks at a time. A reality that has shaped everything from local supply chains to how families plan travel for medical care, education, or simply visiting relatives on a different island within the same small province. That isolation exists specifically because of geography, and that same geography places Batanes directly inside one of the most active typhoon corridors anywhere on Earth. The Philippines as a whole sits within the Western Pacific's typhoon belt, one of the most storm-prone regions on the planet, a stretch of ocean where warm sea temperatures and consistent atmospheric conditions combine to generate more tropical cyclones each year than almost anywhere else, and Batanes occupies the very tip of that exposure, regularly in the direct path of storms, forming out over the open Pacific, before they curve westward toward mainland Asia. On average, roughly 8 typhoons pass near or directly through the province each year during the main storm season between July and October, an extraordinary frequency that has shaped virtually every aspect of daily life here for centuries, from architecture to agriculture to the rhythms of the fishing calendar itself. Not every one of those systems makes a direct, devastating hit. Storm tracks shift constantly, and many pass close enough to bring heavy rain and rough seas without delivering their full destructive force. But the sheer consistency of that exposure, year after year, has meant that few places anywhere in the world have had as much practical, hard-won experience building a functioning society around near-constant storm risk. Faced with that relentless exposure, the Ivatan people, the indigenous inhabitants of Batanes, whose distinct language and culture set them apart from most other ethnic groups in the Philippines, developed one of the most genuinely remarkable examples of disaster-resilient architecture found anywhere in the world. Early Ivatan homes, like traditional houses elsewhere in the Philippines, were originally built from lighter materials, wood, bamboo, and thatch, but centuries of repeated destruction eventually pushed the community towards something sturdier and far more permanent. The result, known locally as the raku, is a stone house with walls built from limestone and coral rock, often reaching nearly a meter thick, capped with a steeply pitched roof woven from kogon grass piled up to a meter deep, a combination engineered specifically to withstand both punishing wind and relentless rain. The thick stone walls anchor the structure against violent gusts, while the deep, densely packed thatch roof sheds water efficiently and resists being torn away entirely, even during the strongest storms. Its aerodynamic, tightly bundled construction functioning almost like the hull of a ship turned upside down and set atop a fortress. A traditional Ivatan house typically consists of two connected structures. The main house itself, built almost entirely from that heavy stone and lime construction to serve as the family's primary shelter and refuge during a storm, and a separate. Some of these houses have stood for well over a century, weathering dozens of typhoons across multiple generations of the same family. A level of structural resilience that has made Ivatan stone houses a genuine subject of study among architects and disaster researchers looking for lessons that might apply to vulnerable coastal communities elsewhere in the world. That architectural resilience reflects something deeper about how Ivatan culture as a whole has learned to coexist with near-constant environmental threat. Rather than treating typhoons purely as emergencies to survive one at a time, Batanes has built an entire cultural and practical framework around anticipating them. Traditional knowledge passed down through generations includes reading subtle shifts in wind, cloud formation, and animal behavior as early warning signs long before modern forecasting technology arrived. Alongside carefully timed planting and harvesting schedules designed to get crops safely gathered before the worst of typhoon season sets in, families adjusting what they grow and when, specifically around the predictable rhythm of the storm calendar, rather than treating each season as an unpredictable gamble. Root crops that can be harvested and stored ahead of a storm's arrival, rather than delicate produce that would be destroyed by a single bad night of wind and rain, have traditionally made up a significant share of what Ivatan farmers choose to plant. A quiet but deliberate agricultural strategy built entirely around risk management. Community cooperation runs just as deep, neighbors traditionally helping each other reinforce homes, secure livestock, and stock emergency supplies ahead of an approaching storm. A mutual support system built not around individual preparation alone, but around the understanding that the entire community's survival depends on everyone looking out for everyone else when the weather turns, an ethos reinforced repeatedly by generations of shared experience surviving the exact same kind of disaster together, storm after storm, decade after decade. Batanes has become locally famous for its so-called honesty stores, small roadside shops, often little more than a simple stall stocked with snacks, drinks, or handicrafts left entirely unattended, with a price list and a small collection box where customers are simply trusted to leave the correct payment themselves. It's a system that would be almost unthinkable in many parts of the world, but one that reflects a community small and tightly connected enough that reputation and mutual accountability still function as a genuinely effective social safeguard, without needing a shopkeeper physically present to enforce it. Daily life across Batanes still moves according to rhythms shaped directly by both the sea and the province's uniquely rolling, windswept landscape. Rather than the dense tropical forest found across much of the rest of the Philippines, much of Batanes' terrain consists of wide, open, grass-covered hills, a landscape so strikingly different from typical Philippine scenery that visitors have nicknamed certain stretches of it the country's own version of the rolling green hills more commonly associated with places like Scotland or New Zealand, a stark, almost otherworldly contrast to the palm-lined beaches most people picture when they think of the Philippines. That open, treeless terrain isn't purely a natural accident either. Centuries of relentless wind have shaped which plants can realistically take root and survive here, favoring low, hardy grasses over the taller trees that dominate more sheltered parts of the country. Cattle, water buffalo, and horses graze freely across these open hillsides, largely unfenced, a common and genuinely picturesque sight across the islands that also reflects a long-standing agricultural tradition built around raising livestock suited to the province's cooler, windier climate, noticeably milder than the tropical heat found across most of the rest of the Philippines, with temperatures here sometimes dropping cool enough in the winter months to feel almost startling to visitors expecting typical Southeast Asian humidity. Fishing remains just as central to Ivatan identity as farming and livestock, particularly the seasonal arrival of flying fish, known locally as dibong and dorado, called arayu, both of which appear in the surrounding waters in significant numbers during specific months of the year, and have shaped not just the local diet but entire community. Celebrations built around their harvest, including local festivals timed specifically around the arrival of the flying fish season each year, drawing families together for feasts and traditional dances, celebrating the catch that has sustained the islands for generations. Traditional Ivatan fishing methods, passed down through generations of families who have read these same currents and seasonal patterns for centuries, remain central to daily life on the islands, even as some younger fishermen have gradually incorporated more modern boats and equipment into practices that, in their essential rhythm, have changed remarkably little over time, still governed by the same careful attention to weather and sea conditions that has always determined whether a given day is safe enough to head out onto the notoriously unpredictable waters surrounding the islands at all. Perhaps nothing captures Batanes' relationship with its own harsh climate more visibly than the Vakal, a traditional headwear and upper body covering woven from the fiber of a local palm plant, worn historically by Ivatan women working outdoors to protect against both intense sun and driving rain. A practical, genuinely ingenious piece of traditional clothing that has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Ivatan cultural identity. Still worn today both in daily practice among some older residents and proudly displayed during cultural festivals and celebrations across the islands. Batanes' isolation and its distinctive culture were shaped as much by history as by geography. Spanish colonizers didn't establish formal control over the islands until the late 1700s, considerably later than most of the rest of the Philippines, which had already been under Spanish rule for well over 2 centuries by that point, meaning Ivatan culture developed with a degree of independence and self-sufficiency that left it noticeably distinct from lowland Filipino traditions elsewhere in the country. Closer in some respects to cultural traits found among indigenous groups in Taiwan and the northern Philippine highlands than to the Spanish-influenced Catholic culture that dominates much of the rest of the archipelago. Even the Ivatan language itself remains distinct enough from Tagalog and other major Philippine languages that it stands as its own separate branch within the wider Austronesian language family, a linguistic marker of just how independently this small, remote corner of the country developed compared to the rest of the nation. That relative isolation continued well into the modern era, and even today, reaching Batanes typically means booking one of a limited number of daily flights connecting Basco to the Philippine mainland, flights that are themselves frequently delayed or cancelled entirely due to the same. Since roughly the 1950s, a steady stream of Ivatans has migrated away from Batanes toward other parts of the Philippines, particularly regions like Cagayan and Bukidnon on the mainland, seeking broader economic opportunities that the small remote province simply can't offer at the same scale. Limited land, a challenging climate for large-scale agriculture, and consistently disrupted transportation links have all contributed to that ongoing outward migration, even as those who remain continue to maintain deep, active connections to Ivatan language, customs, and community life. In recent years, Batanes has also become an increasingly popular, if still genuinely difficult to reach, tourism destination. Travelers drawn specifically by the province's dramatic rolling landscapes, its centuries-old stone architecture, and a sense of remoteness and cultural distinctiveness increasingly rare to find anywhere else in the country, along with a reputation for exceptionally low crime and a slower, more considerate pace of life that many visitors find genuinely refreshing compared to the busier tourist circuits found elsewhere in the Philippines. The growing interest has brought welcome economic opportunity to a province that has historically struggled with limited outside income. Small guest houses, local tour guides, and family-run restaurants, increasingly supplementing the traditional mix of farming and fishing that has sustained island households for generations, but it has also introduced new pressures, small businesses, and family-run guest houses now navigating a level of visitor demand. The island's modest infrastructure was never originally built to accommodate, from limited flight seats and hotel rooms during peak season to growing questions about how much further tourism can expand before it begins to strain the very traditions and quiet cultural rhythm that continue to define daily life here. Provincial officials and community leaders working carefully to manage that growth on Batanes' own terms, rather than letting outside demand dictate the pace of change entirely. None of Batanes' hard-earned resilience means typhoons have stopped taking a genuine toll. Powerful storms have repeatedly caused serious damage across the islands in recent years, destroying crops, damaging even some of the province's sturdiest structures, and occasionally cutting off communities entirely from outside help for days at a time, while seas remain too dangerous for boats and skies too unpredictable for aircraft, leaving families to rely almost entirely on stored supplies and neighborly support until conditions finally allowed relief and communication to resume. Recovery efforts after a particularly severe storm often stretch on for months, farmers replanting fields wiped out just before harvest and families rebuilding damaged outbuildings, even as the resilient core structure of the traditional stone house itself typically survives intact, a small but meaningful mercy repeated after storm across generations. Climate scientists studying the wider western Pacific typhoon belt have raised concerns that a warming ocean could intensify future storms even further, potentially producing more frequent, more powerful systems than the ones Ivatan architecture and agricultural practice were originally refined to withstand, adding new uncertainty to a community that has already spent centuries adapting to conditions most other places on Earth would consider simply too hostile to permanently settle at all. And yet, generation after generation, Ivatans have chosen to stay, rebuilding stone walls that have weathered a dozen storms before, replanting fields after each season's damage, and passing down both the practical knowledge and the quiet, steady temperament required to keep living somewhere this exposed to nature's relentless power. What Batanes ultimately proves is that resilience isn't necessarily about eliminating risk entirely, since that was never realistically an option here. It's about building an entire culture, architecture, agriculture, community trust, and inherited knowledge alike, specifically designed to absorb whatever the storm brings, and to simply begin rebuilding again the moment it passes. If a community this exposed, this resourceful, and this quietly resilient surprised you, subscribe, because there are more places out there proving that the harshest environments on Earth don't have to be empty. They just have to be met with the right kind of preparation and the right kind of people.